All right, everyone, what's happening out there? Jeez, that sounds like a lot of feedback, does it? Forgive me, fucking just after switching around the old system, resetting it up here in the studio again. And it just sounds like it has fucking bit of feedback in the background now since I just started. Of course I would start hearing it when I started streaming, so I'd know what the crack is there. But anyhow, fucking forgive me. What's happening, Bobby? What's up? Forgive me for those who might have watched this already on Tuesday. Didn't realise that this was actually streamed on Tuesday evening at 6 p.m. So very irregular time for this to be happening. Regularly it was on a Thursday, kind of in around the afternoon time. So forgive me for missing that one. Today's one is an engagement on drug policy. Engagement on drug policy from an American perspective. So it'll be interesting to see what they have to say, and maybe how their opinion differs to yours, Bobby, or maybe what you might have in common. Oh, so that is about to start there any second now. I believe, yeah, it starts there at like the 26th minute mark. Do I have anything else I want to get off my mind there now? Oh, happy 420 to everybody. I done a little live stream there as well the other day. You might have caught that. So yeah, Monday it was 420. We had a little bit of a celebration here in Ireland, above in Dublin on the Saturday. There was another celebration that happened in the Stephen's Green area on the Monday. Not too sure how that went. I'll certainly have a look and see if we can find some videos or something to have a look at later. There we go. That just going to quickly pause it there for a second before we get rolling. Yeah, that Saturday went really well. Anyway, there was about 20 odd people of us there, 3 days notice, so that's the reason why we kind of the small numbers. But still, nonetheless, it was a great day, intimate group. We had a soccer ball, frisbee, some great music. The edibles were off the walls. Is that the correct term to use? Like, they were absolutely amazeballs. I had to catch a 6 o'clock train home, so 4:20 rolled around. We all kind of blazed up, celebrated. I chomped down some of those cakes. I was eating it up until about 5 o'clock. It was such a big bloody slice. 250 milligrams on it. Made my way back to the train station around kind of the 20 to 6 mark, and all I can say is that was I can't even remember the train journey home. I just slept the whole way. I can remember just pulling into Cork, getting up, having a floaty walk home would be the correct term. Maybe it was kind of just floating away. A little bit not as stumbly like, but I wasn't walking in an exactly straight line, if you will. It was certainly the highest, maybe the most stoned I've been in quite some time. So it was a great day Saturday. Hopefully you all had a good one wherever it was that you celebrated the 420 anyway. So let's get rolling anyway on this. As Bobby saying, I bet we'll have a similar outlook on weed is good, drugs are bad. Okay.
I'd like to acknowledge apologies from deputies the Cahirlock, Gary Gannon, and Podrick Rice. Deputy Rice will be stepping in and substituting for Deputy Gannon, and Senators Ryan and Senator Niquillan. Also, apologies, Senator Devine, who I think potentially Deputy O'Muraku will be substituting for at some stage. So I call the meeting to order and advise members that we are now in public session. It's understood that Deputy O'Muraku is substituting for Deputy Devine, and I'm pleased to open the 22nd public meeting at the Joint Committee and the 6th session in our Legal Issues module. I welcome our witnesses today, Ms Nicole Luongo, Policy and Systems Change Analysis and at the Canadian Drugs Policy Coalition, Mr Kellen Russoniello, apologies for any mispronunciations, Director of Public Health at the Drugs Policy Alliance, Mr Jack Farrell, PhD, candidate in Criminology at Simon Fraser University, DJ Larkin, Executive Director at the Canadian Drugs Policy Coalition, and Ms Isabel Pereira, Senior Coordinator for Drugs Policy at the Justice. Just a quick note on privilege before we begin. I'm reminding witnesses and members of the long-standing parliamentary practice that you should not criticise or make charges against any person or entity by name or in such a way as to make him or her or it identifiable, or otherwise engage in speech that might be regarded as damaging to the good name of a person or entity. Therefore, if your statements are potentially defamatory or in relation to an identifiable person or entity, you will be directed to discontinue your remarks. It is imperative that you comply with any such direction. I would also like to remind members of the constitutional requirements that in order to participate in public meetings, members must be physically present within the confines of the Leinster House complex. Members of the committee attending remotely must do so from within the precincts of Leinster House. This is due to the constitutional requirement that in order to participate in public meetings, members must be physically present within the confines of the place where Parliament has chosen to sit. In this regard, I would ask any member partaking via Microsoft Teams that prior to making their contribution to the meeting that you confirm that you are on the grounds of the Leinster House campus. So in relation to the engagement with witnesses, as agreed, witnesses will have 5 minutes each to deliver their opening statements, to allow sufficient time for questions and answers with the members. If necessary, further or more detailed information is needed, that can be submitted to the clerk for circulation to the members. So moving on now to opening statements, I would like to first invite Ms Nicole to deliver her opening statement. We've no sound.
Are you able to hear me now?
We can, thank you.
My apologies for that. We did a tech check yesterday, but something went awry. Thank you to the Honourable Committee for inviting me to speak with you today. My name is Nicole Luongo. I'm the Policy and Systems Change Analyst for the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, which I will refer to as CDPC. CDPC is a national, non-partisan civil society organization in Canada pursuing drug policies that are grounded in scientific evidence, public health and safety, and human rights. I have held my position for 5 years, during which time I have undertaken academic and legal research, drafted, analyzed, and evaluated policies related to drug use and the social determinants of health, and engaged with diverse government, civil society, and public sector stakeholders. Prior to joining CDPC, I completed a graduate degree in medical sociology. I also have extensive lived experience of criminalized drug use and Canada's substance use treatment system. I look forward to addressing the committee. I have carefully reviewed the Citizens Assembly on Drug Use report, and I will draw from lessons learned in the Canadian context to offer insight into how the recommendations therein can be successfully implemented and maximally effective. Given my limited time, I will focus on 3 substantive areas. 1, distinguishing the harmful effects of drug use from the harmful effects of drug laws and policies. 2, the role of public attitudes and beliefs in drug policy reform. And 3, designing robust substance use treatment services. I have submitted additional briefing material that significantly expands upon my opening statement. First, distinguishing the harmful effects of drug use from the harmful effects of drug laws and policies. And my key points here are that many of the harms that we attribute to drug use are in fact harms derived from drug laws and policies. The primary driver of drug-related harms is drug prohibition. Therefore, reducing drug-related harms at their source will require a radical overhaul of the international and domestic drug control regimes. At the outset, I will emphasize one crucial fact that I hope will be internalized by the committee and seriously considered as it advances its mandate. Many of the harms that we attribute to drug use are in fact harms derived from drug laws and policies. Put differently, CDPC adopts the position that although all drug use is associated with some risk of harm, drug use is made far more harmful by policies and laws that criminalize it. Indeed, the primary driver of drug-related harms is drug prohibition. Now, this can be a challenging concept. It is one that I will happily elaborate on should I be asked to. Ultimately, I urge the committee to reflect on how it will separate drug-related harms from drug policy-related harms as it develops, implements, and evaluates drug policy reforms. Second, the role of public attitudes and beliefs in drug policy reform. My key points are that the success or failure of drug policy reform hinges on public support. Information about drug policies must be communicated to the public clearly, accurately, and early. Special attention must be paid to engaging with marginalized communities as well, particularly those who have historically not been granted inclusive access to the public sphere. The Canadian context has taught us that public support, or lack thereof, is a crucial determinant of a policy's success or failure. The committee will hear more today about the province of British Columbia's 3-year decriminalization policy. As I have detailed in my supplementary materials, decriminalization in BC was not a failure of policy so much as it was a failure of messaging. The public was repeatedly misled about what decriminalization was, as well as its purposes, objectives, and limitations. Additionally, in my work with language minority communities, I have learned that many marginalized groups have not been adequately engaged about governmental drug policy decisions. I urge the committee to consider how it will communicate information about future policy decisions clearly, accurately, and early to generate and sustain public support for them. Third, designing robust substance use treatment services. My key points are that substance use treatment alone will not eliminate drug-related harms. Treatment is not an appropriate intervention for many people who use substances. And to be safe and effective, treatment services must be accessible, high quality, culturally responsive, and voluntary. So I will emphasize here that drug use is not synonymous with having a substance use disorder, and that substance use treatment is not an appropriate intervention for many people. However, there will always be demand for these services. In December of 2025, CDPC published an organizational position paper on substance use treatment that I was the lead author on. The paper foregrounds 4 principles for ensuring that treatment services, which include withdrawal management services and inpatient and outpatient treatment, advance well-being, dignity, choice, and equity. For treatment to be safe and effective, it must be accessible, high quality, culturally responsive, and voluntary. I am eager to say more about how these principles can be enshrined into policy and practice if I am asked to. Thank you again to this honorable committee for inviting me to speak with you today. I greatly appreciate your time, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. I now invite Mr. Kellen Russoniello.
Good evening, members of the Joint Committee. My name is Kellen Russoniello, and I am the Director of Public Health for the Drug Policy Alliance. DPA is the leading organization in the United States working to address the harms of drug use and drug criminalization through policy solutions, organizing, and public education. We advocate for a holistic approach to drugs that prioritizes health, social supports, and community well-being. Thank you for the opportunity to speak about policies that reduce the harmful impacts of drug use. We need a comprehensive approach that addresses communities' concerns and meets people's needs regardless of their relationship to drugs. This includes evidence-based education and prevention and readily available and effective harm reduction, treatment, and recovery services. Treatment must be available on demand, affordable, low barrier, and tailored to meet individual needs. This includes increasing services that address polysubstance use, co-occurring mental health conditions, and other health and social needs. In the United States, treatment for substance use disorder remains highly fragmented and riddled with barriers to access. Long wait times, high costs, and limited flexibility, including many programs that require abstinence, deter many from entering treatment and lead others to drop out. Many regions of the U.S. still do not provide access to the highest standard of care for opioid use disorder, methadone and buprenorphine, which reduce withdrawal and cravings and cut overdose risk by up to 50%. While recent changes have increased access to these life-saving medications, access remains far too restrictive, especially for methadone. Harm reduction interventions complement treatment by providing a lifeline for people who are not ready to enter treatment and connections when they are. One harm reduction intervention that has demonstrated success in reducing overdose deaths, improving health, and enhancing community safety is overdose prevention centers, OPCs. Staff in OPCs monitor participants for signs of overdose and intervene to prevent or reverse overdose, saving lives. OPCs do not provide drugs, but participants can bring pre-obtained substances. Though OPCs have existed in many parts of the world for nearly 40 years, the first recognized OPCs in the U.S. opened in New York City in 2021. That same year, the state of Rhode Island enacted legislation to establish OPCs, with their first site opening in 2025. Participants have utilized the OPCs in New York over 244,000 times since opening in November of 2021, and staff have intervened in over 2,000 overdoses with no deaths. In the first year of operation of the Rhode Island OPC, participants utilized the service nearly 8,000 times, and staff intervened in nearly 200 emergencies with no deaths. The OPCs in both New York and Rhode Island connect participants to a variety of health and social services, including substance use disorder treatment when people are ready. Other harm reduction interventions include syringe service programs, which provide sterile equipment that reduce the spread of infectious disease, and naloxone for reversing opioid overdoses. Drug checking has also expanded in many states. People can test what is in their drugs, allowing them to make more informed decisions about their use that reduce risk. Many states have amended their paraphernalia laws to exempt drug checking equipment and services. Some states have taken steps to reduce the criminalization of people who use drugs, which serves as a barrier to seeking help. The state of Minnesota recently repealed criminal penalties for possession of paraphernalia, joining several other states that do not criminalize it. Criminalizing drug use and drug use equipment deters people from accessing health services and leads to behaviors that increase risk of overdose and infectious disease. Even with a comprehensive array of services, criminalization of drug use and possession will continue to be a barrier of accessing services and exacerbate health inequities. Further, the drug supply remains ever-changing and unpredictable. We need to engage in conversations about decriminalization, safer supply, and sensible regulation. I have focused on policies that have shown success in reducing drug-related harms. Of course, the United States also has a long history of implementing drug policies that not only do not work, but amplify the harms of drug use and create new harms. Unfortunately, the federal government is taking a regressive approach to drug policy focused on militarized supply-side interventions, harsh criminal penalties, and forced treatment, all while cutting funding for basic health services and interventions that keep people safe and healthy. This threatens the progress that has been made in recent years to reduce overdose deaths, which remain above 70,000 annually. This harmful approach should be avoided elsewhere. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. I now invite Mr. Jack Farrell to deliver his opening statement.
Hi, I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to speak today. My name is Jack Farrell. I'm a PhD candidate at Simon Fraser University, and my research focuses on how meanings of drug policy are constructed and disseminated. So my knowledge of drug policy is academic, but it also comes from my experience of working frontline in housing shelters, both in Dublin and in Vancouver. And my observations today are grounded in my doctoral research, a systematic framing analysis of 187 news articles on decriminalization in BC. Having reviewed previous sessions, I understand the committee has already heard extensive evidence on whether decriminalization is effective and on what model Ireland might adopt. These are critically important questions. However, a policy's success is not only shaped by how it is interpreted, debated, a policy's success is not only shaped by its design or effects, but also in how it comes to be perceived, interpreted, and debated. My statement today focuses on the lessons that can be taken from British Columbia's experience of decriminalization, specifically with regards to media narratives, political debate, and public opinion. In BC, decriminalization was effective in reducing drug-related arrests, yet it quickly became associated with rising disorder and public drug use. Despite the absence of clear empirical evidence linking the policy to these outcomes, a narrative of disorder came to dominate how the policy was understood and ultimately contributed to the decision to end it. While some have taken BC as evidence that decriminalization does not work, I would urge the committee to avoid this conclusion. Instead, the key lesson is that when it comes to perceptions of policy success, narratives about decriminalization matter as much as the effects of the policy. If anything, the decision to end decriminalization is a testament to the power of storytelling in drug policy. So I'd like to offer 3 recommendations to the committee. First, if Ireland introduces decriminalisation, it should expect and prepare for a media backlash centred on disorder and public drug use. Responding effectively to the backlash will require 2 things. First, it is essential that the effects of decriminalisation are distinguished from broader structural issues such as poverty and housing, which are the primary drivers of public drug use. Second, public concerns about disorder must be taken seriously. Even when perceptions of disorder are not supported by evidence, they reflect real experiences of insecurity. Dismissing these concerns as irrational or as a moral panic is not only ineffective, it risks alienating the very public whose support is needed. Second recommendation. The parameters of success must be defined clearly at the outset of decriminalisation. One of the challenges in BC was that decrim was judged against immediate, visible conditions, while at the same time its intended benefits, such as reducing stigma or improving access to care, were long-term and difficult to measure. If success is not clearly defined at the outset of decriminalisation, the policy will become vulnerable to being judged as a failure, regardless of its actual impact. Third, media debate must be complemented by sustained public engagement and education. Policymakers cannot expect their desired meaning of decriminalisation to be passively transmitted to the public. Direct engagement with communities must begin before implementation and continue long after, recognizing that attitudes shaped by decades of prohibition will not change overnight. Crucially, this engagement must include the leadership of people who use drugs. As highlighted by Ishka in a previous session, involving people who use drugs is not only a matter of human rights, but of policy effectiveness. Finally, I want to stress that the success of decriminalisation depends not only on well-designed policy, but on a clear and compelling vision of what it represents and what it signifies. Drug policy reform is ultimately an argument about what kind of society we want to build. If decriminalisation is to succeed in Ireland, it must clearly articulate a vision of why it matters and how it will contribute to a society where people are not criminalised for their suffering. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Farrell. And I'd now like to invite DJ Larkin to deliver their opening statement.
Good evening. I hope you can hear me all right. Thank you to the Honourable Committee for inviting me to speak with you and inviting me to be in attendance on the campus for this hearing by way of video. I am the Executive Director with the Canadian Drug Policy Coalition, the same organization as my colleague, Ms. Nicole Luongo. I am also an adjunct professor at the Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University and a lawyer with 15 years experience in constitutional and human rights law in Canada. Having reviewed the Citizens Assembly report, it contains a wealth of information and thoughtful recommendations. So in this introduction, I will focus on 4 themes emergent from that report based on experience, research, and data from the Canadian context. First, structural stigma. Second, education. Third, implementation. And fourth, international treaties. Beginning with structural stigma. This is a theme throughout the report, and stigma is often conceptualized as a personal belief that operates on an individual or social group level. Stigma, however, it also manifests through law and policy. So stigma reduction campaigns should consider how legislation and approaches to decriminalization, diversion, or depenalization may unintentionally reinforce stigma. Key points in this regard. First, maintaining an overarching criminal label on activities like drug possession can create a cognitive dissonance in public discourse that actually limits the success of stigma reduction education. Next,
Heavy reliance on diversion to substance use treatment as the primary alternative to criminal sanction can create an either-or understanding of substance use and drug policy that encourages support for involuntary health-based detention and alternative forms of criminalization. And third, the structural and internalized stigma that can be inherent in an activity being labeled as criminal has a chilling effect on a person's willingness to speak openly about substance use, to seek care, and to seek emergency support. So I would urge this committee to consider first the legislative amendments that possible on how drug possession and also street level sharing of drugs or poverty-based selling of drugs are categorized, and what criminal legal sanctions may attach to those activities. Second, implementing clear Good Samaritan protections in legislation and institutional policies that provide amnesty against arrest, prosecution, conviction, and other sanctions such as eviction or academic sanction for people who seek emergency services at the scene of an overdose. Moving to education. Here my brief comments will focus on education directed towards young people. Key points of note: prevention education does not and will not prevent all drug use or address all of the reasons why young people may use drugs. It can unintentionally motivate drug use as a form of subversion or an expression of autonomy. Second, young people are often more comfortable seeking support and assistance from peers. So it is of utmost importance that young people receive not only prevention education, but also age-appropriate harm reduction and overdose response education. Moving to implementation. Clear, achievable goals and outcomes-based evaluation is essential, especially in a complicated context such as this. Key points of note: eradicating or significantly curtailing the drug supply, or stopping all gang activity, or forcing criminal organizations to divest from the drug trade are not plausible outcomes at this time. So goals focused on reducing harm, improving health, social, and economic equity, while acknowledging that drug use will continue to occur, provides a more targeted and practical focus. For example, using an outcomes-based evaluation, if you were to look at the rates of drug seizures, arrests, or diversions, those are not actually indicators of success per se. Rather, assessing those should consider whether such activities are generating beneficial or negative social, health, and equity outcomes. And then establishing both immediate and midterm goals can support early success and reinforce public support. For example, prioritizing immediate low barrier naloxone availability and mandatory training, and establishing compassion clubs for people most at risk of harm as an urgent midterm goal. Finally, I'll speak briefly to international treaties. There is no international consensus that UN drug control treaties are producing health and human rights compliant outcomes. I urge this committee to prioritize implementation based in international human rights standards, and specifically looking to the international guidelines on human rights and drug policy in your work. And within the UN drug control treaty system, states are not obligated to categorically enforce those treaties through prohibition and interdiction. States retain the power to take alternative action domestically, and several have done so, including Canada's cannabis reforms and numerous decriminalization policies around the world. I welcome questions on these submissions or any other aspects of the report that are within my knowledge, and I have submitted a supplementary brief that expands on my comments. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. We are now going to move to questions. Each member will have 7 minutes in this first round. Oh, I'm sorry. Excuse me. Just before we move to questions, we have Ms. Isabel Pereira. Apologies, Ms. Pereira.
No worries. Good afternoon, good morning to everyone, and thank you to the committee for this invitation. And also, it was great to hear my colleagues present on their extensive work and re-meet some of them again. So I will be sharing on the experience of Colombia's decriminalization model, which is 30 plus years in the making. I'm a drug policy coordinator at a human rights NGO based in Colombia. So firstly, where is this decriminalization model rooted, at least for us in our work in the Justicia? We anchor the decriminalization model in a human rights framework. The argument is not merely pragmatic in a sense that decriminalization moves resources and frees up resources. It's more than that. It holds that criminalizing personal consumption is an intrinsically disproportionate state response that violates personal dignity, privacy, and autonomy. And the Constitutional Court in Colombia, many times over, has reiterated the core values of this decriminalization model, because the state cannot criminalize self-regarding conduct that causes no direct harms to others. For example, simple possession is a sole conduct that is inherent to the individual himself. So this framework is also in line with the international guidelines on human rights and drug policy that have been mentioned before. In terms of the legal process that we had in Colombia to achieve our decriminalization model, back in 1986, our national narcotic statute introduced criminal sanctions for any activity related to personal possession or use of drugs, severe sanctions. But then through a constitutional court ruling issued in 1994, it was way back in the day, we were quite the pioneers. The court decided that all criminal penalties for personal possession were unconstitutional. And it's rooted in three core rights that are enshrined in our 1991 Constitution: the right to personal autonomy, the right to privacy, and the constitutional guarantee of the freedom to develop one's own personality. Once this decision was adopted, the court has reiterated in many rulings that possession cannot be sanctioned, but the issue around personal use has had some other setbacks. So there's a key legal tension here, is that because our decriminalization model has been established through court rulings and not through comprehensive legislation, it has presented a persistent gap between constitutional rights on paper and their enforcement on practice, a gap that should be anticipated in any decision that you should take and should be closed proactively, so the legislative design proactively protects and prevents these gaps to become possible. The most prominent gap that we have faced is the introduction of the police code in 2016. Because even though decriminalization, as I have outlined, continues to be the norm, the police code introduced administrative sanctions for personal use and for use in public spaces. So these administrative sanctions can effectively recriminalize people who use drugs, even under a decriminalization model, which is the situation we are in right now. The police code introduced administrative fines and seizure for possession and use of drugs in public spaces and many other circumstances. And the Constitutional Court in 2019 struck down these as unconstitutional, but again, because there was no legislative process to prevent this from happening again, Congress introduced again some of these sanctions. Then in 2023, the court reviewed and revised these rules again with two critical rulings. On possession, it reaffirmed unambiguously that this is a private, constitutionally protected conduct that cannot be sanctioned under any circumstance, which was a great decision. However, on the issue of public use, it found that the blanket restrictions are neither necessary nor proportional, but it did maintain them, and it gave power to municipal authorities to define the specific manner, time, and place of restriction. And this is where the problem has arisen. From then onwards, we have a patchwork of violations of constitutional standards. 48 municipal decrees have been issued since 2023, and 17 of them are blatantly unconstitutional. 18 sanction simple possession, even though the court ruling is clear that possession itself cannot be restricted or sanctioned. And at least 10 decrees impose restrictions that are blanket prohibitions in practice because they're 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. a de facto total ban that the court had explicitly ruled as disproportionate. And they operate in all public spaces, eliminating freedom of movement, and have targeted people who, of course, are the people who usually are most severely targeted by prohibition and criminalizing practices. 71% of the sanctions since then to date have been imposed to people between 16 and 30 years of age, concentrating, of course, on young people who are the people who have no private space to use drugs. And most of the sanctions have been imposed on quantities that do not even meet the threshold of the 20 grams of marijuana that are allowed under our personal dose legally in Colombia. So the key lesson here is that decriminalization legislation that leaves discretionary administrative sanctioning powers intact, whether with police or with local authorities, risks reproducing criminalization through the back door. The Colombian data shows that these powers will be used broadly and against the most vulnerable, regardless of constitutional protections on paper. I can, of course, share more information if interested to you on these issues, and I thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Ms. Pereira. Now we will move to questions. And in the first round of questions, members will have 7 minutes each, and then time permitting, we'll move to a second round. I'm going to start with Senator Ruan, then Deputy Burke, and then Deputy Rice.
Thank you. I've 3 kind of questions. I might put the questions out first. The first one, and then maybe if you share out the remaining minutes to speak to them. The first one is in relation to Nicole's contribution on the drugs policy harm versus the harms of drug use. And I suppose that's a conversation we're having more and more, because obviously people visibly look at, a substance and the harm it may have on an individual person's life. And that conversation is definitely shifting to understanding, what is the gravity of the harm of drugs policy, and how that kind of changes the shift in thinking about looking at policy versus the instances of harm of a drugs on a person. So I'm wondering if you could speak in a couple of moments just a little bit more on what are the harms of drugs policy specifically. The second question then will be to Jack, and it's that, it makes me a little bit frightened when we think of, how to measure success. Obviously we've had since I think the late 70s we've had the Drugs Act in Ireland, and they obviously what was the intention of that at the time? Obviously it was in relation to the UN treaty and stuff, but obviously I suppose states or governments or whatever haven't had to prove their success of prohibition, but yet the kind of, when we look to decriminalisation, there's this pressure to show a success in this short space of time from a prohibition that has harmed across generations and generations, and being able to speak about that in terms of, so I'd love to know a little bit more about what you see as a narrative that we can have that's realistic as well, that prohibition, or sorry, decriminalisation is not necessarily going to reduce drug use, and and I think some people think that that's what it's intended to do, but it's actually that harm piece, and if maybe you could speak a little more to that. And then Ms. Pereira, I think it's quite interesting, and I don't think we actually have gone into it very much in terms of constitutional law in Ireland. We don't, I'm not a constitutional expert, but I don't think we have any explicit rights in relation to the right to privacy or the right to bodily autonomy, but I think the courts have I suppose said that within, I think it's 40.3 and 40.32, the courts have inferred that we do have rights around bodily integrity, privacy and dignity through those parts of the Constitution. And I think maybe just speaking to about, maybe you could speak a little bit more to that, especially in relation to not relying on those arguments, I suppose, in terms of the Constitution, but how important legislation is. It's a big conversation here, because obviously we look to the UK, who have de facto in some jurisdictions started to introduce decriminalisation, but it's police-led, and they're doing that because of the lack of will to change the Drugs Act over there, but that actually legislation being a universal application of the law and just how important that legislation is, so that we don't have discretion or de facto practices in particular regions deciding who gets to be decriminalised and who doesn't get to be decriminalised, and that, I suppose, a lack of legislation can lead to that. So they're the kind of 3 areas.
Senator Ruan, do you want to call on one
So if
particular
Nicole,
speaker?
in order of the questions that were asked, so Nicole, then Jack, then Ms Pereira.
Thank you so much for that question. I will try to keep it relatively high level, but in terms of separating the harms of drug use from drug policy and law, I can say that in the Canadian context, in the last decade, more than 55,000 people have died from apparent opioid toxicity. Thousands more have died from stimulant and substance or mixed substance toxicity. So every day in Canada, about 26 people die. And these deaths are not due to the mere fact of drug use. Rates of drug use as well as substance use disorder diagnoses in Canada have remained relatively stable. These deaths can actually be linked to the unregulated nature of the illegal drug supply. So drug-related mortality in Canada has risen at a staggering rate because the substances in Canada's unregulated drug supply have increasingly become unpredictable, contaminated, and potent. And so the volatility of the drug supply is a direct consequence of our drug laws and our enforcement practices. You know, our federal government, in collaboration with provincial and territorial governments, has attempted to eradicate the illegal drug supply by prohibiting activities related to certain drugs. That includes, you know, large kind of drug seizures, border enforcement and interdiction, as well as street level policing. But none of these initiatives actually reduce market demand for drug use. What they do is prevent the government from implementing quality control, oversight, and manufacturer accountability mechanisms throughout the drug supply chain. So by ceding control of the drug supply chain to organized criminal groups, we are amplifying the risk of drug use because, of course, manufacturers are incentivized to maximize profits and to evade law enforcement and border detection. And they do this by adding more concentrated substances to the supply. So large-scale production has not been kind of thwarted by enforcement. Production has just become more sophisticated, more clandestine. And we know that large drug seizures are correlated with increased rates of fatal overdoses as well. And so that is just speaking to the nature of the drug supply under a prohibitionist legal architecture. It says nothing about the health and social consequences of criminalization, and these are myriad. Of course, not everyone, as I've stated, who consumes criminalized drugs has a substance use disorder and warrants medical treatment. But for those who do, they are incentivized to conceal their use and to actually not pursue supports because there are so many consequences that could come from disclosing drug use. We also know that policing pushes people to use in isolation. Again, increases the risk of overdose. And so when we follow people, whether they've been diagnosed with a substance use disorder or whether they've been criminalized, kind of through their institutional trajectories, whether that be in the education system, the employment system, the child welfare system, we know that just the label of being a criminalized drug user implements that kind of structural stigma that we talked about and really informs people's entire life journeys. So when I say we need to separate the harms of drug use from the harms of drug law and policies, that is what I'm talking about. We need to recognize that drug use, although again it is associated with some risk, it is made far riskier and more dangerous than it needs to be by that legal architecture that implements criminal and at times medical penalties for it.
Thank you, Nicole Luongo. Senator Ruan, you had questions also for...
Yeah, for Jack and for Ms Pereira. I know I've gone slightly over time, but I won't be coming back in if we could have a bit of leeway.
Have we agreement with the members to extend the response time here?
I have no problem.
Thank you.
Thank you. Please go ahead, Mr. Farrell.
Thanks, and thanks, Lynn, for that question. I actually think it's connected to what Nicole was just mentioning, that it's an unfortunate reality that people are a lot quicker to attribute harms to drug policy reform than they are to prohibition. But I think one way to think about it is that the debate on decriminalization will not be won the day it's implemented. Decriminalization is something that enables an ongoing discussion. And so part of that is to distinguish the harms of the pre-existing harms that have largely been caused by a century of prohibition. That's not going to be an easy debate. It's not going to be an easy thing to convince the public. But the point of decrim is not just to get the policy over the line. It's to begin and facilitate a public change, a change in how the public think. And part of it, I think, is really important to be realistic. Don't overpromise. Also, I would say that ultimately, it's about decriminalization makes people safer. It makes people who use drugs safer, but ultimately, it actually makes the public safer. That might not be something the public feel on day one or year one of the policy, but it is something that long-term is a reasonable expectation based on what we know.
Thank you, Mr. Farrell.
And then Isabel Pereira.
And Ms. Pereira, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that question. I'm just going to briefly go over some clarification and also some ideas that may engage in your conversation. Firstly, is that this means of achieving reforms through constitutional, what we refer to as judicial activism, is something that is very particular to the Latin American region, as far as I'm aware. Most of progressive reforms in Colombia and in other countries in the region have come through this type of legal activism, bringing cases to courts for many reasons, but abortion rights, marriage equality, and drug decriminalization have come through constitutional courts or Supreme Courts in many countries in the region. So that's just a matter of the context in which we operate. But the protection of these type of rights through courts is one of many journeys that decriminalization can be achieved. And maybe I just want to highlight some pros and cons of having decriminalization through this particular journey. One is that once the decriminalization model was introduced, it seems to me that we were very comfortable with the fact that once criminal sanctions were lifted, not much more was done to bring comprehensive social and health services to this community, and also to bring about the conversation of what decriminalization can actually bring to societies. So in what I'm hearing from colleagues that study other jurisdictions, this public conversation is much more rich, even if there's backlash against the decrim model, through a collective conversation. In the case of Colombia, where it came through a one-sided decision from the Constitutional Court to protect rights, then it's just a norm. It's just one norm that no one really wants to talk about, in the sense that it doesn't bring questions about which services should be put in place for people to be better, even if the legal sanctions are eliminated. There are still more things that could be done to improve quality of life for people who use drugs. And that conversation we haven't actually had. So I think that the journey through decrim via this route sometimes leaves out that broad conversation. It is very much focused on the individual protection of a right, which is, of course, crucial. And the good thing about that is that the court strikes back and again and says, these are the fundamental rights in our Constitution. It cannot be taken away, but it doesn't bring a collective conversation. So I think this is something to bear in mind. Also, whether or not the public, this is, I think, a good side to it with nuance. Whether or not we do win the public debate on decriminalization, I think it's also tricky because, as I said before, there is not much more of a debate. It's just a court decision, and that's where it ends, which is both good and bad. I mean, it kind of lowers the profile of the public conversation on a topic that often is so fraught with tensions that it perhaps has a upside to it to say it's just a court decision. No one can debate whether or not these fundamental rights are protected. But again, we don't have the collective conversation of what should be in place beyond lifting the sanctions, which is, I think, a pending conversation in our country.
Thank you, Ms. Pereira. Deputy Colin Burke.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for your thank you very much, and thank you for your presentations. Can I and for the work that you are doing in this area and providing very useful information to us. Can I just ask, Jack, in relation to the decriminalisation? I suppose there are two issues I want to raise. One, what was the decriminalisation? Was it for the decriminalisation in relation to someone not being prosecuted for having for their own supply, or was there decriminalisation which would allow a person to be able to supply? And the second issue is in relation to, you know, in Ireland, I was involved in where we've opened a supervised injection facility here in Dublin, and it is working very effectively. So in other words, people are going into the centre, they're able to inject themselves. It's supervised, so there's backup support. So if there's an adverse outcome of the injection, then there's staff to deal with it. And rather than people having to be admitted to hospital, there's experienced staff with the expertise to deal with it there. But technically, you know, people going in there with the drug are technically, I suppose, in breach of the law, but we are managing it in a better way so that there's a better outcome for them, because it's now supervised rather than being on the side of the street. And we didn't have a backlash to that. Okay, there was some criticism of it, but I'm just wondering, why was there such a backlash, and what actually provoked that backlash?
Thank you so much for those questions. So the first, what was decrim in BC? It was the decriminalisation of simple possession. So trafficking and supply side charges could still be laid, could still be arrested. It was purely for simple possession. And the second question is a great question. It's kind of the central question of my PhD in a way. Why did the backlash happen? The most interesting thing to me is that it had very little to do with decriminalisation, as strange as that sounds. There was a large amount of animosity and fear and precarity among people in BC, partly even stemming from fallout of COVID, stemming from housing issues, and stemming from policies that existed long before decriminalisation. So really interestingly, that within 3 days of decriminalisation in BC, there was already politicians in the media saying, the debates are over, the results are in, decriminalisation has been an absolute abject failure. So 3 days into the policy, it's not even plausible that effects could have actually occurred. So there was a preset narrative of it failing and it being a failure that was already there. I'm heartened to hear that there was not much of a backlash in Dublin. And obviously the cultural contexts are very different. It could manifest in different ways or not manifest at all. But I think a lot of the backlash came from misattributing what causes social problems. So as Nicole's pointed out earlier, there is the symptoms of disorder, let's say, in BC. There is visible homelessness. These are things that people see and it makes them scared and it makes them feel in danger or threatened. Once you give them a reason, an explanation for this, a scapegoat really, that's what decriminalisation became. But the backlash came from real feelings of insecurity and precarity, even things like cost of living, housing, a more general sense of things becoming out of control. Okay. To summarize, I would say the backlash had very little to do with the policy of decriminalisation, and a lot more to do with much broader feelings of fear, anxiety, and like precarity experienced by the public.
Could I just ask the contributors from Canada, especially Professor Larkin, I mean, if she was in charge in the morning now, what changes would she make in order to get the buy-in and also get the benefits of the policy that currently exists? What changes need to be made at this stage? Because obviously what we're watching in Ireland is not making, I suppose, in the same way as I said about the supervised injection facility being opened, it was a long drawn out event, but like everyone was involved, from the Gardaí to the government departments to the educational sector, right across the board. There was a whole lot of people involved in the development of the facility. And I'm just wondering what mistakes were made that there now needs to be buy-in in Canada in order to improve what currently is there.
Thank you very much for that question, and certainly would echo much of what my co-presenters and colleagues have said. In terms of what needs to change, if we focus first on decriminalization, there's the implementation aspect and some structural aspects to it. In terms of implementation, there was a great deal of thought that went into core planning within a select group of people, and that was a good group. Unfortunately, it was not coupled with doing really proactive dialogue. And I say dialogue intentionally rather than education, because dialogue is what is essential, where you get to hear people's concerns, actually have a discussion about shared goals, and give space for people to express their concerns in a way that they feel safe in doing so, and can receive evidence-based information and have an opportunity to actually sort of change their perspectives. That did not happen. Essentially, decriminalization was announced. There was some press releases. There was optional training for police officers that was quite problematic in its design and not taken up in the way that it needed to be. And there was not a dedicated engagement both with communities, law enforcement, and municipalities.
But just looking at it now, what needs to be done in order to get that buy-in? That's what I'm wondering.
Yes. Well, I think we could look to a community dialogue model, and I would point to my colleague, Ms. Luongo, on this. Actually going back to municipalities, places where their concerns have been raised, and saying, let's talk. I would like to hear what your concern is, and actually walking people through a process of discussing the issues and discussing what goals they would like to see is essential. If we do that, what we have seen in our dialogue-based work is that people can shift their perspectives very, very quickly, but it has to be a conversation. The second thing is really needing to address the limitations of decriminalization and the context of our housing crisis and the nature of the drug supply. So decriminalization is more effective if our services are responsive. In the Canadian context, most people inhale their drugs now, but most supervised consumption services do not have inhalation. Those folks can't go inside. So we need to address that. Second, we need to address the drug supply. People are upset at seeing people in public spaces, partly because they are sedated for longer because of benzodiazepines and tranquilizers in the supply. And third, we need to address the implementation and design of decriminalization to really reflect the amounts that people carry, remote communities and marginalized communities, and implement decriminalization in a way that is honestly cognizant of those poverty issues.
Just finally, can I just ask, but isn't it difficult to change people's views, especially families where they have lost a loved one? I mean, isn't that a big challenge now in itself?
And that issue, that right there is so core, because almost everyone is coming to this conversation from a place of a level of grief and loss, and how we respond in those moments is really important. So the approach of being with people who have faced struggle or loss and being able to walk through a conversation about how criminalization actually isn't going to have the result that we want. Neither is involuntary healthcare detention. It can actually increase those risks and break down those family units, so it is much harder to build those systems of care. And trying to prohibit all drug use simply isn't going to happen. So let's implement policy that is practical and make sure that our loved ones today know what's in the drugs, have somewhere safe to go, and are not ever scared to call an ambulance.
Okay.
If we can agree on those things, we can get to those policy changes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Deputy Burke. Deputy Rice.
Thanks very much, and thanks to all of the witnesses for the presentations today. This is my first time speaking at this committee. I'd like to just set out my own position. I think our drugs policy and legislation has fundamentally failed. It's failing individuals, their families, communities with devastating consequences. So we urgently need reform of the law and the policy to reduce harm in particular. And we see it in practice in my own constituency in Cork. Particularly public drug users policed and moved from one part of the city to another, causing issues in communities, without then a lack of addiction support services. Unlike Dublin, we don't have a safe injection facility, or I think what was described here as an OPC, and really lacking those services and supports that are really crucially needed for people. And I suppose I want to I've got two questions in relation to that, about what needs to change, and one in particular on the safe injection or the overdose prevention centres. The response that I've received from the Minister when I've raised this issue with her about opening one in Cork, as they have in Dublin, is that we have to wait until a pilot is completed, and that will take an extended period of time because we need to review the evidence. But I'd be interested to hear from, particularly from Gillian, who mentioned this about, I know in your statement you said that they've existed for 40 years around the world, so there must be an extensive bank of international evidence there that could be used to rely on for why this should be done. And maybe if you could just talk to us a bit more about some of that evidence that is there and the effectiveness, so that we don't need to rely on Ireland on our own, reviewing our own pilot and delaying further, because there was a very significant delay between the initial cabinet approval and the opening of the safe injection facility, a number of years delay, and we cannot now have that again in expanding to other parts of the city or other cities, and I'm really keen to see progress there, so be interested in that evidence. And then the second question was for DJ. You mentioned establishing as one of the kind of the medium-term goals, establishing compassion clubs for people most at risk of harm. You might just talk a bit more about that. That's a new concept to me, so you might just talk a bit more about that. Thanks very much.
Yes, I'm happy to jump in first to talk about OPCs. So yes, as I mentioned, that they have been in place. The first one opened nearly 40 years ago in Switzerland. And since then, there are almost 200 now operating around the world. And I would invite my colleagues from Canada to speak on this more, because they have a longer history with supervised consumption sites in Canada than we do in the United States. But the nearly 40 years of evidence does show consistently that overdose prevention centers save lives by preventing overdose deaths. They reduce the spread of infectious disease by providing sterile use equipment and providing access to primary healthcare services for people who are injecting or smoking. They provide a pathway to substance use disorder treatment for people who want that, and other health and social services, including housing and employment services. They are also provide a lot of benefits for community safety. Like we were talking about, a lot of the concern, at least in the United States, and I imagine the same in Canada, is around public drug use. And one of the solutions to that is to provide a place for people to not use in public. Because when you do provide a place that is welcoming and provides connections to services, people come to use them. And we found that over and over in the research as well. I'd be happy to follow up with the committee to provide annotated bibliography of the studies that have been done on OPCs over the years. There's a really great resource put forward by Brown University. That's a collection of all the research that has been done. But again, over 40 years has demonstrated that they have consistent benefits, and each time they are implemented somewhere new, we see those benefits repeated. As you alluded to, in Ireland, we have the same problem in the United States, where one jurisdiction says, well, we haven't tried it here, so we don't know if it works. But every time we have seen these implemented in new places across the world, we have seen those benefits repeated. I share the frustration about the pilot program, but it is something that I think we can agree on at this point. That the evidence shows that they are totally effective and they save lives.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. So regarding compassion clubs, so certainly the notion of a compassion club is something that has operated in a number of arenas and issues. Within the context of substance use, this is a model that exists within a spectrum of interventions that really look at how do we stop some of the most immediate and egregious harms that are actually produced, as my colleague noted, by the drug policy context and the drug supply. So in Canada, there have been very limited programs to offer prescription-based access to certain substances like hydromorphone, diacetylmorphine, and sometimes stimulants through a prescription-based model. And the goal there is to immediately remove a person from the unregulated drug supply to greatly decrease their risk of overdose death or injury, and to help someone exit from a criminalized market environment and criminal activity. Those programs were very limited in Canada, and they have structural limitations in terms of accessibility and how effective they are. So in my additional notes, in my additional brief, I've linked to a couple of resources about Compassion Club models and non-medicalized models for implementing immediate action. Looking at Compassion Club specifically, when someone who uses drugs regularly, has used daily, is at significant risk of overdose harm and death, and is seeking that immediate safety, first of all. Second, seeking to access those other wraparound services and to build a sense of community with people who have a shared experience, and to increase that sense of social inclusion, to improve the ability for folks to, be a part of community and be seen as part of community. Compassion Club models can be very powerful. This can be done through regulated mechanisms where people work with government to get access to drugs that are of known ingredients and potency, and they are provided on a not-for-profit basis to very specific members of a Compassion Club who are vetted in terms of what is their substance use and how is this going to be properly controlled. And we see that there's basically immediate benefit to this type of program. In Canada, we've tested that through the Naomi and Salome trials with both diacetylmorphine or heroin and hydromorphone. Unfortunately, the Compassion Club that has operated historically in Canada was not granted legal authority by the federal government, so they couldn't access those substances through a legal mechanism. But because honestly, so many people were dying every day, it was so incredibly urgent to act. They took action and sourced substances through the dark web. They tested them through the best technology available, packaged them, labeled them with health warnings, worked with very experienced researchers from a number of universities to build the club and develop a membership. And they provided those drugs at a not-for-profit basis. And immediately we saw results. People were not overdosing and dying. People were not overdosing requiring naloxone. And those social determinants are starting to show improvement. Unfortunately, that club was shut down because government did not participate to support it through a legal pathway. But there are legal ways to do it. It can be very effective, quite immediate, and it solves a lot of your problems in terms of both criminal law involvement and health risk.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Carla.
Thank you. Deputy O'Moroku.
Thank you very much for all your input. And I suppose if we go through a number of, committee engagements in the last while, I suppose something that has been pointed out is it's trying to deal with all the issues, unfortunately, that come from drug use and drug misuse. It's everything, obviously, from the criminality, the violence that goes with it, the absolute chaos in people's lives, the health impact, and obviously in absolutely brutal circumstances, deaths that can be caused. And obviously what we have done to date across most of the Western world, and people talk often of the war on drugs as being an abject and absolute failure. So I suppose we are trying to get to grips with something that works better, that works from a point of view of putting the health supports around the addict, but also can deal with the societal ills that can also be caused. And in fairness, a number of you spoke about issues that existed around decriminalisation, and I think we had also dealt with it in some of the previous ones. I think even Cian O'Croher would have dealt specifically with it last week around that idea where people spoke about the Portuguese model, and one of the issues was greater drug use, or visible drug use. And I suppose from our point of view, there's probably simple enough fixes on that you ensure that there's still an illegality to that piece, that it is not absolutely allowable, while we then have to look into more novel means of how we allow people that are going to take drugs to take them in a more appropriate, for the want of a better term, in more appropriate settings, and where they are safer, but also providing those supports that can actually facilitate people in harm reduction and even getting themselves beyond that. And I suppose my big question is, it is the learnings from the examples that you have given. And I think it's fair to say, when we're talking about drug use, as much as it's prevalent across all socioeconomic groups, but where the real issue generally is in poorer, more deprived communities, and you're dealing with multi-generational trauma, you're dealing with housing issues, you're dealing with obviously lack of resource issues, and where you don't have those supports, you create the conditions for this to happen. But I would also say that I can never move away too much from also making the point that you have to deal with serious criminals. You can't be seen to let that go. In an awful lot of cases, they have a detrimental impact, particularly in those deprived communities. And also, they are the bad examples sometimes that is left to kids who don't necessarily have the supports we should provide to them, and they just see it as a means of, getting out of there or making money and whatever else. So the question I'm asking, and I suppose I'll start with Jack and DJ, is from a point of view of what you've seen to date. It's if you were starting again, what would I suppose the best means of offering decriminalisation, because it'll need multiple other supports there also. And I really was bought into that idea, obviously, of having, rather than education and talking down to people, that idea of having a conversation and meeting them halfway on the worries that they have. So if I could start with Jack and then DJ.
Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I agree completely that decriminalisation will need a host of wraparound policies and supports for it to be really effective. And echoing what another member said, one of those examples would be to implement supervised consumption sites more in Dublin, more in rural areas. It's actually something very important from the BC context, was rural areas have a real lack of harm reduction, even though Vancouver has a lot more, let's say. So, and connected to this is just what you're mentioning about public drug use. Ultimately, that's not caused by drug policy one way or another. People use drugs in public because they don't have a house to use them in. So personally, living in Vancouver since 2019, I have not noticed any change in the amount of people who use drugs in public before decrim, during it, and we're now about 4 or 5 months out from it not existing. Public drug use hasn't gone down. So the amount the police enforce laws on people using drugs in public, it doesn't do anything to the amount of people who use drugs in public. So I think that's a really important point. It goes what I'm saying, that really housing is the issue when it comes to public drug use. And the second thing is about if the idea or the goal of decrim of increasing people to supports, that only works if there's supports.
Yeah.
So you need to also have investment in health infrastructure, in housing infrastructure, and those more targeted interventions like supervised consumption sites, compassion clubs, as DJ mentioned. Yeah, I would definitely recommend that there's a whole host of interventions, that decrim should not be seen as just, we'll do that and everything will figure itself out. That definitely won't be the case.
All right, DJ.
Thank you. So I think that around this question of visible drug use, again, like my friend here, I will challenge whether or not that was actually true. There's a few things happening. First of all, we do have a housing crisis. Secondly, enforcement was quite inconsistent prior to decriminalization. And, to the question that was raised earlier, when there isn't a legislative change, you see really inconsistent policing practices, and there's a study from BC indicating that that was the case. So I think one of the questions that needs to be asked is, what are the drug possession laws being used for? A lot of the backlash that we saw in BC was around law enforcement saying, I don't have a mechanism to move this person along so that their poverty is no longer visible and making people uncomfortable. So not using drug possession laws for a health purpose or for the core purpose of a criminal sanction, but rather using it as a way to render people invisible. And so there was an argument essentially that it was harder to make structural suffering that people are experiencing less visible and thus less uncomfortable to people who are housed and have access to care. The second question that we would raise in the BC context is the changes in the supply. So again, I'm also in Vancouver and travel, to Victoria and other places in the province. I can't say that I saw an increase in public drug use. I did see an increase in the length of time people were sedated, so it was more likely that someone would be noticed. Our drug supply contains chemicals that can cause hours of sedation, which makes people see it more. And third, we have a confirmation bias problem. As soon as you start talking about something and you start attributing it to one particular policy, people start to reinforce that notion. So those are the first questions I would ask. Secondly, to the point of wraparound services, housing, healthcare, all of that. Yes, I agree. And policy reform towards decriminalization should not be stalled because it will take time to deal with healthcare systems and housing. We need to be able to talk about the actual just discrete benefit of decriminalization. And the question I sometimes ask is, do you agree that there's someone who's at risk right now? Okay. Do you think that putting them in jail and having someone experience withdrawal and then be re-released to the streets and have even less access to housing, have a criminal record, be more excluded from their communities, is that going to make that better? And if the answer to that is no, then even while we are working on these broader systems of support, we should be supporting decriminalization and depenalization. Very quickly, the housing piece, I'll just say yes, absolutely. And oh my goodness, we all have a lot of work to do on housing. But when the drug supply is unregulated, just being mindful that using a loan in housing is actually quite an extraordinary risk. Finally, to the question of who is impacted, yes, it is often folks who are really at multiple intersections of marginalization. But I would be interested to know in your context, because in the Canadian context, it's blue collar workers, people working in construction, trades, transport, who are also being very disproportionately impacted and dying. And these are people who are in the workforce but are not finding places where they feel comfortable talking about substance use or reaching for help. And when it comes to serious criminals, yes, the question is, are you looking at the harm, violence, corruption, extortion, and are you looking at those multi-markets and multi-mechanisms that organized crime groups work within? Or is there an over-focus on drug law enforcement with the sort of ostensible goal of let's eradicate the supply? Because that over-focus on drug law enforcement doesn't tend to be effective.
No.
Thank you, Deputy O'Rourke. It's now my turn, and thank you all for your participation today in our meeting and for the work that you're doing. And it's really interesting to listen to your contributions and your experiences. If not a little depressing, Ms. Pereira, to hear it's 30 years on and the challenges sound as daunting as what we face, albeit in a different environment. But that is a very sobering number, 30 years. And it sounds like that's 30 years of iterations and lives that are being lost and damaged and affected. So it is very, very sobering. And we have an enormous challenge here as a committee to try and take the Citizens' Assembly recommendations and make concrete recommendations to government for changes to policy and legislation. And I think what I'm hearing from you is a consensus or an urging to us, and I'd like you to confirm or reject that we really need to lead from a health and a social perspective. So health, housing, poverty, each of you have referred to them at different times. And obviously at the start of all of that, just a human rights perspective, as opposed to leading from a legal initiative. Because where it's a legal initiative, while it's got the authority of the law, or constitutional authority, it actually isn't motivated from a collective support. Would you agree with that assessment? Maybe Ms. Pereira and then Jack Farrell, and I would appreciate hearing from you all on that.
Thank you for this question. It is sobering, while also I think very encouraging that a country that has been at the center of global drug policy decriminalized 32 years ago, and we have been able to protect that core of rights protection for people who use drugs. And even though there are still some setbacks in the sense that administrative sanctions, as I mentioned, are put in place, I do believe that lives have been saved in the sense that so many people who could have gone to prison for the simple act of having drugs in their possession have not gone to prison. And I think life trajectory for a person who does not go to prison is a life that can be as certain it has been saved. So it is sobering in the sense that there are still challenges, and of course there will still be backlash, but it is also something that I think as Colombians, at least those of us who work in human rights and drug policy reform, continue to be very proud to have been able to protect this legal standard for so long. But to your question, the legal protection, of course, is not enough. In our context, the legal protection is crucial to enable other processes to take off. But what happened with our decriminalization model, in my view, was that when it was adopted in 1994, drug use was not a prevalent issue for Colombian society. Actually, prevalence of use in Colombia is very low. We are talking about 1% of the population has used drugs in the previous year. So it's a very small, concentrated population. It's not as widespread as in other areas. Of course, it has gone up. In 1994, it was not a social concern whatsoever. It was a very isolated issue. What we have now is that even though we have the legal protection, because the model was designed at a time that all of these issues that you've been talking about today were not a concern, there was no design of what health and social services should be put in place to be able to have this wraparound services for people who use drugs and the communities where they live. So the legal protection, it did lift the restriction. So harm reduction services were able to operate, but it was not a state or public-driven intervention or public-driven policy. It was just isolated services, mostly funded by international cooperation and international philanthropy, that were more often than not intermittent in their operation, and this left people more at risk. And it was never part of a national strategy to have this wraparound harm reduction services. I think what this leaves is the invitation for those jurisdictions where these models are just about to be designed to have this in mind, as you have stated, that the legal protections are, I see it as a step, as a step in a part of a larger process. It is a step because, of course, we need to bear in mind that if a person's conducts or activities are criminalized, there is no way to have a proper relationship with the state. If the personal use is still criminalized, there is no way to build trust. There is no way to go and reach for services. There is no way to call for help. So legal protections are necessary, but we don't expect legal protections to transform the social and health challenges that are not inherent, but that come with drug use or with these circumstances. It is one of the many steps that should be designed in a more holistic type of intervention.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Farrell.
Thank you for the question. I think, rhetorically, I think you're right that relying solely on framing this as a legal issue comes with some pitfalls. I think about how the BC government talked about decrim in the media, and they focus almost all their energies on the harms of criminalization. But it was very hard to see what decriminalization was for. It was mainly about what it was against, what it was not. That's not an effective framing strategy. You have to tell people what the meaning of this is, not just that the last thing was bad, but that this is meaningful, that this is good, that this produces something. So I think definitely to avoid a purely legalistic framing of it, I would say, like it or not, drug policy will always, hopefully not always, but for the moment, it's going to be talked about as a moral issue. A lot of people just interpret this as a moral issue. And so it's a bit of a tightrope for the government of any country to implement decrim. You have to both constantly be talking about evidence, but also be able to engage with the moral arguments. And as the discussions have gone on, have a dialogue. There's a tightrope between like morality framings and effectiveness, practical, those type of framings. That's the balance that's essential, I think.
Thank you. Mr. Russoniello.
Yeah, just to jump off of what Mr. Farrell was saying, we've come to the realization, and this has been sort of borne out through research that we've done and other folks have done here in the United States, that we need to change how we talk about these issues. I think, like Mr. Farrell was saying, for a long time, we've been saying no to things, and like we need to get rid of this system because it's bad and it's causing all these harms, which is true, and I think we do need to continue that as part of the conversation. But we also need to really validate the actual feelings and experiences that the communities are experiencing. Yes, there are public space challenges. There are issues around public use. There are issues around people not having enough housing and people feeling unsafe. And we can't dismiss those concerns. And really what we found is that, for a long time in the United States, there's been this, you have to have this certain tough on crime perspective, or at least politicians perceived that you needed to be tough on crime in order to get elected to office. But what we've found through recent polling is that a stronger message is to be serious about solving these issues, not to dismiss it, not to say, we don't need to criminalize that, but to come at it like, yes, you're right. These are real issues and I'm going to solve them. But the way that we solve them is not by throwing people in jail. The way that we solve them is by providing access to treatment when people need it, by providing, community centers where people can go, by providing harm reduction interventions. And that polling actually does much better than when someone comes out and just says, yeah, I'm tough on crime and we're going to throw the book at people and, they'll never see the light of day again. So we're hopeful that that's really going to help us guide to change the narrative here. But I do think that we have a lot of work to do, and that's part of the dialogue that my co-presenters have been talking about.
Thank you. Ms. Luongo.
Thank you for that question. I will echo everything that's been said already, and I'd like to just take a moment to focus on kind of that more health-related framing. In terms of what is effective when it comes to public messaging, certainly approaching drug use as an issue of public health is more effective than that solely criminal legal framework. However, I want to add a bit of nuance to that as well. There is a distinction between public health framing and individual health framing. And by that, what I'm alluding to is we don't know that it's particularly effective to advance the narrative that everyone who uses criminalized drugs is sick. And I can use alcohol as an analogy here. We don't assume if someone says, I'm going to the pub to have a drink, that they are an alcoholic, that they need alcohol use treatment. Yet when it comes to criminalized drugs, that is still often kind of the framework we're applying to people. And when it comes to kind of changing public attitudes and beliefs and generating support for drug policy reform among the public, positioning everyone who uses drugs as sick and in need of treatment can actually be counterproductive. So I'm not trying to make your lives even harder, but I would caution against solely advocating to switch to a health-based narrative without getting really clear on what that actually means, because calling people sick can actually amplify stigma. So there is a distinction there between the public health and individual health framings.
Thank you. And Ms. Larkin.
So perhaps this is a little bit of a different take. Looking at this question of, should we look at this through as a legal issue or a legislative reform issue or health route, these are not distinguishable entirely. Trying to implement sort of a public health focused policy is to an extent stymied when we're not also looking at legislative reform and having a conversation about those policy contexts. And that comes back to how certain activities are labeled and how maintaining a criminalized approach to, say, drug possession, while also saying treatment responses are essential, does continue to create a false expectation. My colleague, Ms. Luongo, spoke to that a bit, but it also creates a false expectation for what government can accomplish, because if the only two options that people are looking at are essentially criminal sanction or treatment, there are going to be a lot of people who are not in treatment. Perhaps because they do not need it, perhaps because they are not ready for it, perhaps because they cannot access it. So that dichotomy actually creates a space where the public can become concerned and say, well, I thought that everyone was just going to go to treatment. And in Canada, where we've seen that lead is to a proliferation of involuntary detention legislation, laws at the provincial level, saying people can be detained off the street and sort of forced into these treatment systems, despite there being a lack of evidence to support that those are safe, effective, and human rights compliant. So really looking at these two at the intersection, both talking about the legal aspects of depenalization, decriminalization, and those public health goals is really important. And again, coming back to this question of not only talking about what we are seeing that isn't working, but rather looking at something like decriminalization and health-based approach through the lens of, we really want young people to have good employment and school prospects. Great. A criminal record or a healthcare-based harm limits that. We want people in the trades to be able to get help when they injure themselves and to be able to stay in the workforce. Great. Decriminalization and a public health framing and a dialogue actually helps us with that. We want families to be strong and communities to be strong. Great. Changing our legislation and our approach to drug possession helps families stay connected and helps people stay in community in a way that actually benefits that larger, community wellness. And so, but we can't actually sort of pick an either or in terms of those framings.
Thank you very much, Ms. Larkin. Deputy O'Murco, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, well, just to follow on that, I thought that piece was actually very, very good, and it's that idea of, like people use drugs for various different reasons. They're in different places in relation to it. Like I've already stated, like you need a wholesale element of supports to reduce those that engage in this, but also you need a whole pile of different solutions to, let's say, the person using cocaine as opposed to the person at 14 who starts taking heroin because they're just literally trying to obliterate, that is wrong in their lives. So it's providing all of that. But it was something Kellen had said, and I suppose it's that idea of having a real conversation around, from a political point of view about solving this issue. Because even on decriminalisation, as the chair said, like you can just become involved in something that becomes a legalistic question, and decrim good or bad, depending on what position you take. And what I find, and an issue I have in relation to Ireland from time to time, is that an awful lot of people become engaged in a daft conversation. It becomes, you're just, people will give out about anyone who engages in a conversation around decriminalisation or looking at something novel. You're just interested in going easy on, whoever, and we'll probably use a derogatory term in relation to addicts and whatever else. But my issue with them is they generally aren't following it up. Well, like, they're not talking about, even not that I would be proposing it, like something absolutely draconian from a policing point of view. They're literally just talking of continuity of the status quo. So I suppose we do need an element of courage. We do need an element of having a conversation with people around their worries, but also stating that here is the reality of drug use in Ireland or anywhere else, and here's how we best solve it. And it is the idea of, it's the health-led intervention for those that need it. It's whatever other interventions are necessary. And also, even from a point of view of dealing with criminality and violence and all the rest of it, if you're freeing up the courts and the police from dealing with really low-end pieces that are not necessary, well, that's a win all round. And I suppose it's getting that together. And why I probably focused earlier on the whole conversation around public drug use, because, and I'm going to pronounce his name wrong, I think it's Dr. Leteo de Silva had spoken, from a policing point of view about how excellent he had seen the improvement in relation to the operation of the Portuguese model. But he said just one of the issues that came up, and again, it could have been confirmation bias, was the idea of just there being more public drug use in certain places. And my only point was there has actually been significant over and back by this committee in relation to just means to deal with that, while accepting at the end of the day, if you want to deal with particularly that relates to, very visible among marginalised people who take drugs, that we need earlier interventions that wrap around families at a very early stage, and that's the abject failure. But I suppose it's that idea, and whoever wants to comment on it, is the idea that we need to have a real conversation of, here are the issues, here are the problems, and here's what we can do. And again, decriminalisation only works alongside multiple other supports, that there is no silver bullet in relation to this, but we can make things a hell of a lot better for the individuals out there and for wider society. Now, I think I used up all my time because of
You're okay. You can ask.
All right. So can we start at the top and finish at the bottom?
Go ahead.
I'll actually.
Sure. That's me. Okay. Yeah. I think it'd be useful just to get clear on the public drug use issue, at least in BC. The BC Centre for Substance Use, in a report, have written that there remains no systematically collected evidence that public drug use increased after decriminalisation. But you would not believe that if you read the news. It's common sense knowledge that public drug use increased despite any evidence. So I think that goes back to my main point in the opening statement, is that the perceptions of drug use, perceptions of what the effects of decrim are, don't really have anything to do with evidence, but they need to be dealt with. The narrative part is really crucial. And it's just how easy it is for pre-existing social problems, visible homelessness, crime, to become attributed to decriminalisation. It felt like everyone got amnesia here. The day before decrim, everything was the exact same. The day after, all these problems were caused by decriminalisation. And I know in Dublin, there's a mismatch in, the amount of people fear being victimised in Dublin. There's a perception that violent crime has gone up a lot. Doesn't match with the data. I would worry, I could see something similar happening where that narrative around violent assaults or whatever, if decrim were to come in, suddenly that would be, decrim caused all of these issues. So, I think public drug use is really a matter of narratives, and it's not really a matter of the effects of drug policy.
I think it's Isabel next. Just
Sure. I'm thinking about two issues based from our experience. I think that when we go through the protection of individual rights, it is useful. And the reason why it is useful is because people continue to champion and it gives people agency. The reality of a legal decision that says you have the right to autonomy creates agency. And that has been one of the factors that has been protecting this jurisprudence for so long. So I think it's not irrelevant in that sense. But then there's the other side of it in terms of drug use in public spaces, which is the question of what is it that people care about, people in general. The conversation here has been mostly about the availability of public space. There is not that much public space available. And because it is so scarce, then there are tensions about who gets to use it. The regulations and the powers that the court gave to municipalities to decide who and when get to use public space that is already very scarce made that tension very prominent. And it's not that it didn't exist before, but it made it more visible. So people care about the parks, and people care about who gets to use the parks and at what times. And of course, there is a huge conversation here about kids in the parks. And it's not to dismiss, as many of my colleagues have said, is not to dismiss that concern. But then we turn the conversation around. If, for example, we were to regulate time and space where public space can be used by people who use drugs, and then we have blanket prohibitions who prohibit 24 hours a day, but then in theory, there shouldn't be a kid in a park younger than 10 years of age or even 15 years of age at 10 p.m. in a park. So, I mean, if there is a space, can we get to agreements on who gets to use them and when? Maybe that takes very hyper-localized conversations. It hasn't been done yet, and we're in the midst of those conversations, and it is difficult, especially because then we go back to the issue, is this an issue about drug use in public space? Or the issue is that there is a responsibility from the state and public policies to make sure that everyone has public space for whatever they need to use it, be it exercise or just recreation or whatever. But because there are no policies to make cities livable, we're all crammed in these spaces and fighting for space between each other. But that is not the responsibility of the person who uses drugs, but the responsibility of the state. So in terms of narratives, as Jack was mentioning, the fight for the narrative of who is responsible for what becomes very crucial. And I think we need to situate the responsibility very clearly on who holds the responsibility to provide space, because we're fighting for space in the end.
Right, Kellen?
Yes, thank you. I think first, if we're not part of the conversation, then we're already losing the conversation. And I think this has been a problem for a while, at least in the United States, where we've kind of ceded the public safety position to law enforcement, and therefore we are not seen as credible anymore, and law enforcement is seen as like the voice on community safety. So that is something that basically we need to be re-engage in the conversation and reclaim that narrative, because community safety is not just about having law enforcement present in communities and arresting people for drug offenses. It's much bigger. It involves a lot more systems, and it involves making sure that communities have the resources that they need to thrive. And ultimately, those resources will lead to less need for law enforcement to enforce. I do really like the idea that Isabel brought up of the hyper-local community conversations. I do think that those are going to be super important, and those conversations are already happening. And again, if we're not part of those, I think that, you know, ultimately those can grow into something much larger that then becomes much harder to react to. I also just want to reiterate that, you know, when people are offered the solutions that we know work, that are based in a health approach to drugs, people agree with us. They want to see more resources for people who use drugs. They want to see communities having the resources that they need to survive and thrive. And they don't necessarily want to see more jails and more law enforcement presence in their neighborhood. They want other resources that are going to help them feel safe. I think Mr. Farrell had mentioned this in his opening comments, that the messaging around decrim and other drug policy reform is just as important as the actual policy, because if it's not messaged in a way that people are understanding what's happening and how it's being implemented and the impacts that it's having, then that is going to be turned on its head, and we're going to end up having to defend ourselves backed against the wall. So I think that to the extent that we can, we need to be joining these conversations, and essentially we need to be creating our version of the drumbeat for progressive drug policy reform, our version of confirmation bias that eventually builds out where it is changing the hearts and minds of the public at large.
Yep, a real conversation. Nicole?
Thank you for that. Yeah, I will just add that it's critically important to engage with people over sustained periods of time. We use the word dialogue because it's not simply disseminating information unilaterally to a population or even having a one-off meeting. That sustained engagement is important because it allows you to tease out what people's actual concerns are. In my work, I spent many months engaging with one particular community, and kind of at the outset, I heard, I hate drugs and I hate people who use them. But over months of work, I was able to discern that what that intense reaction was actually attributed to was people's own kind of the precarity they were experiencing as well. And so there was the perception that people who use drugs were monopolizing resources, and kind of this competition over scant resources had incited a lot of the anger that I heard. But that is not something I would have understood after 30 minutes or an hour. So I know resources are limited and you can't engage with every single population for a long time, but conceiving of how you can systematically have those dialogues to ensure that when you are hearing people's concerns, they are not being misattributed, and then you can actually address them. And relatedly, there is a real risk that we have certainly seen in the Canadian context of overpromising and underdelivering. So when it comes to decriminalization is not going to reduce overdose fatalities because the drug supply is still illegal and therefore unregulated. But when it was initially presented, it was kind of framed as this solution to drug-related deaths. And we knew that that would not be an outcome, but the public didn't understand that. So when drug-related deaths continued to increase, it provided an entry point for the public to say, well, obviously decriminalization is failing, when they were misled about it in the first place. Similarly, supervised consumption sites or drug consumption sites are not going to prevent overdose because people are still using contaminated drugs, nor will they solve poverty and things like that. So we have to be really clear on what we're actually promising to the public when we pursue a policy. Thank you.
Right, August, DJ, please.
I'm not going to respond technically sort of to this question, but rather kind of chatting with my aunt at the dinner table way. Often around this question of like, how do we have a conversation? I'll start with questions like, do you think that there's ever been a time in human history when people didn't use some kind of drugs, including alcohol? No. Do you actually think there's a version of the world where suddenly no one uses drugs or alcohol? No. Okay, so this is a thing that human animals do. So do you agree that it's really hard when we're seeing folks in our communities suffering in public and in the places where we want to feel like relaxation and joy and community, but these public spaces become intersections of where people have access to when they don't have something else, and that's uncomfortable, right? Yes. Okay, so the next question is one, who do we want to be right now? Who do we want to be moving forward? Because that informs everything. And the second is to be really realistic that everything we're talking about today, we're calling it substance use, we're calling it drug policy, we're calling it harm reduction. We are talking about structural social issues, health issues, socioeconomic issues that are way bigger than just substance use per se. So yes, we are talking about drug policy, but everything around this conversation is bigger than drug policy. And we need to recognize that, again, so we don't end up sort of over-focusing on one policy or one program, because really we're dealing with a number of things. But if we can kind of start with those questions, then we can say, okay, well then let's get practical. We can talk about prevention education, we can talk about early childhood intervention, and all of that is great. But if we agree that some folks are struggling today and that humans have always used drugs of all sorts, including alcohol, including other things, what do we do to make our community safer now? Is safety making sure that people have a door to close at night? Great, let's work on that. Is safety making sure that people have somewhere to go where they'll get emergency response if they have an overdose or if they don't know what's in their drugs? Great, what does that look like, and how do we make sure that's actually accessible to people? Is safety in our communities making sure that people have access to jobs and can stay in school and stay connected to their families? Fantastic. How do we help folks stay on those trajectories rather than cycling through arrest and like criminal legal systems over and over, or being marginalized within our communities to the extent that they, we start to lose contact with our loved ones, and sort of opening on those like core principles and then asking, who do we want to be in this? I think can sometimes honestly be like a helpful way to get folks to express that they really do actually want a more caring, actually safe society, and that actual safety is not often based in law enforcement. It's based in building the structure of what makes us safe.
No, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I definitely went over time there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Deputy O'Murrochú. And at that point, I'm going to draw the meeting to a close. I want to sincerely thank all of our witnesses today, Mr. Farrell, Ms. Pereira, Ms. Luongo, apologies for the pronunciation, Mr. Russoniello, and Ms. Larkin. Thank you all for your contributions here today to our meeting. It has been hugely informative, and on that note, I'm going to conclude our public session today, and we will adjourn and meet at 12:30 on Thursday, the 30th of April. Gormagad, Slán.
And there we go. What do you make of that, Bobby? I think you made the call in the beginning that the Canadians were going to bring the real heat. Yeah, the Canadians did a pretty good job there. I have to give it to them. Forgive me, I've not been able to get my camera back up and running here. I failed to install the bloody utility for it before launching the streaming app. So yeah, you'll see this beautiful face back here next week, not to worry, because that meeting is concluded this time, confirmed, making sure, don't fucking just assume. And it is on the 30th, this day next week. I think that's what happened the week before. I just kind of made the assumption that, like, yeah, it's the following week on the Thursday. But yeah. Sorry, just hitting the old venti here as well. Don't have the bong. I've retired the bong to some degree. Fucking almost 3 weeks now this week. This Saturday, I think, yeah, almost 3 weeks this Saturday without being a daily bong hitter. Been using the volcano and the venti. But yeah, Bobby, I agree with you, man. It's definitely one of the better ones, and that's not to take anything away at all from the last couple of meetings, because they were all real great meetings, great contributions made by the speakers. But this was definitely one of the better ones. Just disappointed really that they didn't talk a bit more about cocaine in Colombia and like the narco gangs and all of that kind of stuff that goes on there a little bit. But I suppose maybe it's talking about drug use, but they always trying to bring it back to blame the drug user for like fucking all of that stuff and the bloodshed that goes on there within the trade, when in actual fact it's fucking policies around the drug user that make us buy fucking illegal drugs. I'd love if they got an old education, an old, what would you call it, an old workshop on the traditional uses of substances like coca leaves and opium flowers and cannabis and mushrooms, it'd be decent, 1 a week, something like what we're seeing here now, where experts from around the world just come in and talk about the traditional uses of these so-called, air quoting there if you could see me, drugs. It would be great. They would benefit an awful lot about them. Especially your man O'Murrochú. Jesus, like that guy, you could really hear it in his voice there as he was talking about, like, you know, just the thought of illicit drug use just sickened him. You could hear it, like, you know, his stomach was turning. The only thing that got him through it was the old thought of the pint later on that evening, and a bit of chat of republicanism with the buddies. No. But yeah, I would have really enjoyed if they talked a little bit about the traditional use of the coca leaf over there. She talked about a very low level of drug use over there, but I'd imagine that if we were to kind of consider the use of coca leaves, would it be that high in Colombia? Not too sure the actual numbers there, but I think it's more Peru, is it? Peruvians up there in the altitudes. Forgive my lack of geography knowledge, but I definitely know it was one of the two of them anyway. I have a lot of mountainous regions where they used it, and not Peru is definitely mountainous, but not too sure it's Colombia though. Don't want to be mixing them up. Something I noticed actually from the use of the volcano and the vaporizers there lately is after you use them, like you kind of feel very clogged up. Like that they're really yeah, they get you phlegmy. But definitely noticing the difference. All right, out running, been prepping still for this marathon, and I think I noticed a difference now from the lack of combustion maybe. But still, yeah, fucking a long way to go to be able to finish this marathon. But every little helps. Every little helps. We see what happens. Convoluted saying, thanks for bringing this to our attention. You're more than welcome, Convoluted. Yeah, if as many people as we can get their eyes on this, the better. We just have to make sure, I suppose, that everything they're watching here and that's been said is actually going to be taken into account when they publish their report. Because if a lot of people see this and they kind of see a BS report that doesn't reflect anything that's actually been presented to them, then we can hopefully do something and call them out on it. But I don't think they will. Some good committee members there. Lynn Rowan, just to name one. Probably the most prominent there, the best one of them all. But she won't let him get away with that. Convoluted said, are you itching for the bong? Babe doesn't just cut it for me. I was initially. It took a little bit. It was just. I think where it really took commitment was when I went to the Thai boxing event there 3 weeks ago. And I was just like, right, I'm going to do it here. I'm going to not hit any blunts or bongs or anything like that for the night. I'm just going to bring my venti, and I hit the venti for the evening. And I did. I followed through on that, and then I just seen it right from the rest of the week. It was there in the utility room looking at me, the bong was, and I was just not. Went a couple of mornings where I actually abstained from consumption just because my routine was kind of changing up. But since, I've definitely gotten friendly now with the volcano, the bag, and the coffee in the morning. And just a single bowl as well. I used to find when I was kind of hitting the bong in the morning with the coffee, depending on what the day had ahead for me, like, Jesus, I could be polishing off like 5 or 6 bowls there easy enough from the bong, depending, again, as I say, what was going on. Whereas this volcano and the bowl, which is quite a large bowl. What do you get into that volcano classic bowl? I think it's about a half a gram. You get about half a gram into that. Get about 4, 5, 6, maybe 7, you know, if you wanted to. Bowls or bags out of it. But it does the job nicely. If you come back for a second, like, you know, you're getting through it, and you're getting a lot more than what you would have been getting from the bong, if you get me, at the efficiency, the delivery. So again, unless you don't have a whole lot going on for the rest of the day, you don't really go repacking that bowl on the volcano too many times. Oh. Yeah, should have talked on production, says Bobby here in regards to the cocaine and all of that. Yeah, big time, big time. The two Canadian women were very sharp. They were indeed, actually. I don't think Colombia leads the pack anymore, but at one point they were number one for sure. How do you mean number one in terms of like quantity, I suppose? Um, ah, to me now, like I would see Colombia as being like the Cali, and when I say Cali of weed, and from an Irish perspective, I don't know what that might mean to yourself over there in New York. But for us here in Ireland anyway, like if you're talking about you got the Cali, it's like you got that Rolls Royce, you know what I mean? You got that top level. I would always associate like Colombian with the cocaine. But yeah, production. It's definitely moved around. I suppose there's a bit more enforcement there in places like Colombia, but I see. I was doing a bit of research into it there only a couple of weeks ago, looking into the illegal production of it and stuff like that, and how coffee coffee farmers are kind of taken hostage, if you will. Again, air quotes there. Hostage by some of these gangs, and they grow the coca leaf in amongst the coffee plants. They kind of blend in there a lot. And yeah, they get paid for it, but there's a lot of threats and there's a lot of intimidation that goes on there as well. A lot of violence. So it would be good if they were actually to talk a bit about the production there. Convoluted said it would have to be car fumes, says Bobby. Oh, sorry, I'm looking back at what Bobby said above. I don't think Colombia. Yeah. What do you think the number one drug used in Ireland is? And Convoluted said it would have to be car fumes. But the number one drug, yeah, if you take away alcohol out of the mix, definitely cannabis. I'd imagine, like, even, yeah, I say alcohol would win cannabis, I suppose. But if cannabis was legal, like, yeah, I definitely think fucking hands down it would kick alcohol's ass here at this stage. I would imagine, anyway. Could be wrong. Put 50 on it. Whichever young lad say, good question, Bobby. I reckon it's close, to be honest. Ganja first, in my opinion, but cocaine is very close, if not more prevalent. A lot of people think it's a more sophisticated drug, and they often look down on stoners. Yeah, there certainly is that going on, alright, but I don't think the use of cocaine comes anywhere close to the use of weed, but I'm very biased in that. And I don't get out a lot at all. Yeah, I don't go to pubs and all of that crack. I'm just hanging out with my stoner buddies, playing stoner poker and all of that kind of crack. Times of me going out was few and far between. That Thai boxing event now is probably the closest out I've been in a long time, because there was an open bar at that Thai boxing event, and there definitely was a I would just say a steady stream of people going in and out of the bathroom. And a few of them were like regulars who didn't look like they had small bladders. Jokes. No drug use at Thai boxing events. Definitely on a smell of weed out the back, anyway. Bobby says cocaine. Bobby says here, if cocaine is the biggest one that doesn't need much assistance, maybe a test kit. Sorry. Heroin, if it's the biggest problem here, and I would imagine in Canada. Yeah, I suppose, like, in what way do you mean problem? Like, I think that it's the drug that people with a problem reach to the most. It's the drug that's associated with problems. It's like when you're hitting that rock bottom, you know what I mean? People are at that. That's why I'd see, like, as probably the biggest problem. Unless then, like, a problem is the supply, contamination. Yeah, definitely those fucking the powders, the pills. They were always going to be the biggest problem for contamination. But cannabis is definitely no stranger to contamination over the last while. And we had that diesel, we've talked about that here loads of times, the diesel hash and stuff like that happened back there in the, late 2000s, early 2010s. Then came along weed to the rescue, which was great for a while until we had contaminated cannabis with the fiberglass and all of that crack. Literally had weed that when you would smoke it in your joint, the ash would stay long and hard. You couldn't top it. If you tried to top it, you'd lose the cherry. Nasty stuff. Now lately, and not so nasty, but still fucking, it's crap. It shouldn't be happening. It's people like getting CBD flower sprayed with like the likes of synthetic cannabinoids, HHC, and other stuff like that. That's definitely been going on. Edibles in the same sense as well. We're getting contaminated edibles with fucking synthetics going in there. People saying it's THC and it's not, and then people getting up into all sorts of trouble then afterwards because potencies and all of that crack. Oh, it's mad. Yeah. So I don't know, just trying to think back into that meeting. Anything else of worth to be repeating? Like Linnerman gave a great question, I suppose, kind of harping on there about the harms of the drug policy. She always kind of has good questions. I'm trying to think of how that was answered, but I think they just reconfirmed what it was that she was asking. Wouldn't surprise me if the government's purposely contaminated drugs like happened with alcohol during Prohibition. They're evil, but but then again, never say never. Never say never. God, it's crazy to think some of the stuff that governments have actually done and continue to do, man. We're like fucking in the middle of a time in the world where governments are like knowingly dropping bombs in places where civilians are living and all of that kind of crazy stuff. Literally, we've been told on one hand, like, save the planet, reduce your carbon footprint and all of this stuff, like reduce, reuse, recycle. And then meanwhile, bombs going off, like fucking throwing all sorts of carbon up into the air and all nastiness. And meanwhile, we still can't grow a bag, growing our own bloody ganj, share an old bag. How on the same planet does that exist? Just make it make sense. Like, it's a thought that always scares me. It's like when I was inside in prison that time, actually, I only spent 5 days in there, but during that time I couldn't help but think, what if some catastrophe happens outside and you're locked in there, all the wardens bail out and you're just stuck there in a cell. What was I there for? For not paying bloody fines for the possession of cannabis because I refused out in protest. But imagine how shit that would actually be to be stuck inside in the prison, inside in the cell after like some, I don't know, like fucking a nuclear bomb goes off, just given the state of the world right now. Think back then I was thinking more along the lines of like a zombie outbreak, but thinking nuclear bomb, nuclear apocalypse seems more fucking realistic now than a zombie one. A zombie one could still happen though. I was practicing sharpening my sticks. Definitely watching too many movies. Be Moonlight, exactly, bro. We're governed by the least among us, unfortunately. Yeah, that's it. Like, I'd love to have known the history of all of their experiences would be with different substances in there, and in the committee. Like, I know Gary Gannon, who has been missing for the last little bit. I'm not sure what's up there. He's the chair of the meeting. He said, look, he's used drugs in the past. I think he's admitted to using cocaine, is it? Definitely cannabis anyway. But he was open and he admitted to it. But it'd be great if they all just were open and admitted to it, because I think it's very important that like you lay that out before you go into a meeting on drug use. So at least people have an understanding of where it is that you're speaking from in there, you know, like your man fucking Rory Muraku, he's probably only ever drank maybe he's never even drank a pint. Do you know, but I think that's important information when especially when you're seeing like fucking how he's carrying himself when he's speaking about the topic. At least you'd understand there, like, you know, he took the pledge by in his confirmation and he stuck to it. And the thought of drug use sickens him. Do you know? Okay, man, I respect a person for that, by fair play, you know, if you stuck to the pledge. And for those who don't know, the pledge is something you take when you reach that kind of almost teenage age. You make a confirmation in 6th class here, just before you're going into kind of first year. Imagine that's high school for you guys over there, Bobby. But you take a pledge to abstain from, again, and even in the bloody pledge, do they differentiate alcohol and drugs? When I think back, actually, you know, it's been a long time since I thought of the pledge, but even back then, were they doing that fucking separation of alcohol and drugs? I can remember I took it and thought I was going to keep to it. I'm going to do this up until I'm 18. No, yeah, I'm going to keep the pledge. Jeez, was it the end of first year, kind of halfway through first year, whenever it was, we definitely had a few bottles at that stage, and it kind of wasn't too long after then, the bit of hash kind of crept in there then as well. But with good intentions, definitely set out like we were going to do it. But, you know, things change. Right, anything else that I can think of there now throughout that meeting that might need it to be repeated? No, as I mentioned there, I've been wanting to go back and make some short videos on these longer videos, kind of like these mic drop moments where there's been hammered, prohibitionists have just been hammered with facts that they just can't argue against. So fingers crossed I'll get the time and effort to get that done. It's just balls that kind of take the studio apart there now. Just picking dampness and all of that kind of stuff. Don't want to be letting this get broke and can't really get it done with the kids inside either. So we see what happens. It's been a blast, everybody. Nice one, everybody in the hot box who's come along for the ride. Hopefully you enjoyed the conversation. For me, definitely it's one that's added to the optimism that something is going to give, something's going to change. To us out there as a community fighting for this, especially in the cannabis, like, just, we have to keep the pressure on. They can't lock us all up. All the evidence is in our favour. So let's not forget that. So until next time, this day next week, much love. Keep it lit. Stay blazed. Peace.